Chapter 5.
That year, I had an admirer, an Englishman. A hopeless dreamer who followed me everywhere. Struck by delusions of grandeur, he convinced me to open a fashion house in London. And so I did. Thus was born 36 Upper Grosvenor Street. The building itself was typical of that area, narrow, 4 floors high. I brought a few of my staff from Paris and settled in 2 small rooms at the top. A young Canadian woman, wealthy and brimming with enthusiasm, volunteered to sell my designs. I gave her a room downstairs, filled it with scarves and accessories. When I returned that first evening, I found her in high spirits. "What did you do?" I asked, suspicious. "Sold everything," she beamed. And it was true. Crowds of curious Londoners had wandered in all day, and she had cleared my entire stock, at half the price I had paid. No wonder the place became instantly popular. From a financial standpoint, it was a bad omen. The London venture was, above all, entertaining. It brought wonderful publicity and led to delightful friendships. But profit? I encountered a uniquely British tradition. They'd rather die than spend. Savile Row lived on credit with elegant justification. But my French suppliers wanted immediate payment. To maintain the Parisian atmosphere in this British adventure, I had to import nearly everything from France. Credit culture in London has evolved since, but back then, it was a battle. Still, London was a charming chapter. Crowds flocked to number 36, and I couldn't help but notice the contrast. The world's most masculine city, London, versus the most feminine, Paris. In fashion, one must balance opposing viewpoints and values. They must be measured, aligned, to create rhythm and harmony. As I gained experience, my mind became more receptive, and for years leading up to the war, ideas poured from me like fireworks. I always had a passion for fabric. More than many of my colleagues, I worked closely with textile manufacturers. They were grateful, and the relationships were strong. They would show me their newest, undiscovered materials, a tradition that continues to this day. I released thousands of innovations, which took courage: tree bark, cellophane, straw, even glass. And the colors, oh, the colors. I became fascinated with British textiles, visiting mills across England and Scotland. The Isle of Skye left a vivid impression. The Duke and Duchess of York, future King and Queen, were ardent supporters. I nearly didn't make it there. Our tiny plane was forced to land in a field. But we were rescued and taken to Duncan MacLeod's home at Skyweavers, where they made some of the most astonishing tweeds. The entire family lived outside of time. At dinner, they arrived with their children, clad in enchanting tartans, pink, blue, green, with topaz and amethyst buttons. These were artisans, but they radiated joy and grace. The men, in their flamboyant attire, seemed more masculine than city dwellers terrified that a splash of color might rob them of their manhood. One morning, the children, already dressed in their vibrant kilts, burst into my room, cheerful as puppies. I toured spinning mills, selecting colors and patterns, marveling at their innate taste. They showed me the herbs and plants they used for dyes, all natural. I learned much and would gladly have stayed with them for months. I also visited the clan matriarch, Lady MacLeod. She lived in a grand castle at the island's highest point. It felt like a Walter Scott novel. She wore a long black cotton dress adorned with a cairngorm brooch. Dear MacLeods. Later, I'd meet members of their clan in France and America. Their appearances changed, their trades diverse, but that effortless, agile grace remained. Some perished in the war. Even the paradise of Skye wasn't spared. It was in Scotland that I first saw black sheep. I had them sheared and used their wool to create rich, heavy fabrics, vaguely reminiscent of Arab woolens. The list of famous visitors to 36 Upper Grosvenor Street could fill a small social register. My staff was endlessly polite and capable. We never argued, except over tea breaks. I could never understand why everything must stop for that dark liquid, to me, undrinkable. It drove me mad. Perhaps I'm unfair, but in France, it's the long lunchtimes that halt all productivity. The late Duke of Kent often visited both my London and Paris salons. Deeply interested in social issues, he'd sit for hours in my little upstairs room discussing society and change. One of the most emotional experiences of my life, and for this I thank Noël Coward, was attending Cavalcade. I believe that play will become a classic, a moment of patriotism in theater. It's a tragedy such work may never be seen again. Sitting at the edge of the stage, I cried, paralyzed by feeling. Other plays of Coward sparkled with wit and elegance, but Cavalcade was genius. Cecil Beaton asked to photograph me. But I'm not easy to photograph, countless sittings had made me wary. Still, I agreed. His studio was like a Victorian dollhouse. Porcelain, plush, covered chairs, blue and blush glass globes. His photography, however, was modern, precise and studied. He made me pose for hours. Finally, with an eerie sensitivity often seen in inanimate things, a massive crystal chandelier, perhaps agitated by my silent fury, crashed from the ceiling, just missing my head. Poor Cecil, in panic, captured the most perfect image in that very moment. Perhaps secretly, he thanked the heavens for sparing him from a fashion-related homicide. One evening, the American hostess Julia Shipman threw a grand party in London. In the midst of the festivities, with Tallulah Bankhead laughing nearby, someone whispered for me to come quickly. In a small salon sat the Prince of Wales and Mr. and Mrs. Ernest Simpson. I didn't know why I'd been summoned, but I joined them. I'd sit for hours, eating bread and cheese, watching barges drift down the Thames in the misty, grey palette of a Whistler painting. This part of the river was cosmopolitan. Cockneys bantered with Italians, Chinese sailors greeted Swedish ones. Men of every nation gathered over beer and cards, different tongues, one language of laughter. It was lively and peaceful. I never quite know how to answer people who ask where I find my ideas. Truthfully, they come to me not at grand balls, but on quiet evenings or countryside drives. Simplicity, ingenuity, the practical beauty of what the English call working people. That inspired me far more than any aristocrat's wardrobe. Necessity has always been fashion's greatest muse. One evening, while designing costumes for Ghosts for Sale, I brought René Clair to my beloved Wapping. He was instantly charmed. We spent hours watching the river drift by, dining in a Chinese restaurant, and reminiscing about Lillian Gish in Broken Blossoms, that haunting, unforgettable film. Where is Lillian Gish now? And what became of Griffith? And just then, the door opened, and Griffith himself walked in. A shadow out of his own films, grey silhouette against a black backdrop, searching, it seemed, for lost time. We didn't know him, but we invited him to sit. He did, and we spent a beautiful evening remembering. Griffith, older now, but still full of presence. Back in Paris, Gabby had returned to Italy. I moved into a small house in a garden, owned by an old Marchioness who never showed herself. My old workshops on Rue de la Paix, number 4, were now bursting at the seams, crowded and chaotic. They offered me Poiret's former house near the Champs-Élysées, but I couldn't part with my old neighborhood. Instead, I chose number 21 on Place Vendôme, a place in the shadow of Napoleon himself. My loyal and clever friend, the illustrator Drian, celebrated the move with a whimsical verse. A swallow from Italy, perched beneath Napoleon, weaves eccentric nests. With her name, Schiaparelli. The facade of number 21, like every structure on Place Vendôme, was designed by Jules Hardouin Mansart in the 17th century. These walls once housed the Royal Library, the King's Stables, and several national academies. But when Louis XIV ran out of funds, he sold the finished buildings and their land to the city of Paris. The Scots are especially fascinated with number 21. John Law, the notorious financier, lived here. After his bankruptcy, desperate investors came to this house to end their lives. Others lived here too, the philosopher Joubert, and the botanist Brutal. I bought the house from the couturier Charette. For years, Place Vendôme was the true center of elegance. It still is, though the nearby Rue de la Paix and Rue Castiglione have become overtly commercial. The towering column with Napoleon in Roman garb on top is now surrounded by banks, jewelry shops, and hotels, notably, the Ritz. This, without doubt, is the epicenter of Parisian luxury. At Place Vendôme, a new era began for me, the Schiap era. 1935 was breathless. I kept asking myself, when will this frenzy stop? First, I opened my boutique, the very first of its kind. Soon copied by couturiers around the world, it became the birth of pret-a-porter. Evening sweaters, skirts, blouses, accessories, all things once dismissed by high fashion were now center stage. Jean-Michel Frank designed a gilded cage for the perfume department. Bettina Jones, later wife of the brilliant and unpredictable diplomat Bergeret, created displays that stopped Parisians in their tracks. I had always decorated the windows myself, with minimal means. But Bettina's displays were bold, clever, and dazzling. They shattered all convention. Pascal was assigned to the front office. Blonde, tall, with the grace of a Greek statue, he never complained about the eccentric costumes he had to wear. He stood, wooden, expressionless, a mannequin made of oak. He became our house mascot. Later, we gave Pascal a modest little wife. She was known as Pascalina. Today, the boutique is a Paris landmark. Tourists photograph it like the Eiffel Tower or Versailles, saving their last frame of film to remember Schiaparelli. Located just steps from the Iron Lady, the Trocadero, Les Invalides, and the Folies Bergère. The boutique became part of the city's story. Now Shia was truly in the game. She squared her shoulders. This was no longer play. Stop, look and listen. That was the theme of the year. It was then that Shia ascended into the rarefied and most fantastical realms of her imagination and released a cascade of fireworks. My creativity and invention unfolded to their full strength, in utter disregard of what people might say, and in defiance of any practical reason. Absolute freedom of expression and the chance to attempt acts of devilish boldness, that is what she craved. In that legendary year came the evening tweed gowns, raincoats for cocktail hours, saris of embroidery, dresses made of glass, buttons fashioned from Louis d'Or and sovereigns immune to any devaluation. The epitome of elegance and fashion, Madame Harrison Williams, owned a gown of pink glass adorned with pink camellias and looked, quite simply, angelic. The headlines were shrieking. Schiaparelli's collections could trigger a crisis. Parisian fashion sweeps over kingdoms and republics alike. At that time the world was carved up into monarchies, republics, and dictatorship, and Europe was absorbed with the Italo-Ethiopian conflict. In the most critical of years, when fashion turns eccentric and mad, it unquestionably crosses over into the realm of politics. Shia, feeling the wind change, presented royal gowns embroidered in pearls, others daringly décolleté. But what left poor bewildered journalists in the greatest shock were the zippers. Not only used for the first time in haute couture but placed in the most unexpected places, even on evening gowns. The entire collection teemed with zippers. Astonished clients bought, and bought again. They were accustomed to seeing odd buttons from our house. That had become our signature, but not this. Yet they grasped, better than I, the meaning of this new trend, and they bought wonderfully. Which was fortunate, for rent kept rising. Alas, on shipping day, the telephone rang endlessly. Furious voices from all our agents echoed the same words. The dresses cannot be shipped. For some strange reason, still unclear to me, an agreement between France and America prohibited the import of zippers. Telegrams flew, transatlantic phone calls blazed. The issue grew to diplomatic proportions. But after several days of hysteria and exhaustion, the dresses were finally admitted into the United States. No one ever raised the issue again. The question of dressing quickly, and the diminishing availability of servants, had become acute. Shia designed kitchen aprons so that American women could remain elegant while preparing dinner. One of the most impacted items was bed linen. Elaborate pleats, real lace, and pure silk sheets vanished. There began a slow infiltration of garments one could wash oneself, and that required little ironing. I recall the story of a melancholic prince who was told that, to find happiness, he must wear the shirt of a happy man. He searched the world and finally found an old man who seemed truly content. "I'll trade you my kingdom for your shirt," cried the prince. To which the man replied, "But I've never owned a shirt." So too, it seems, the modern woman may be happier, with fewer layers of underclothing. The folding screens I mentioned earlier followed me to Place Vendôme, into the grand rooms. Like confessionals, They kept the secrets of many tricks and transformations, but rest assured, those secrets never left the sacred space. Only they had seen the disfigured bodies of those deemed beautiful and the radiance of those considered plain. Schiap would observe, feel compassion, but by 6 o'clock she would leave the office and forget it all. So there was no need to fear. That summer, I traveled through Scandinavia and Denmark aboard Graham White's yacht, with a handful of friends, including my admirer Peter. Sweden, the country that had most successfully solved its social questions, appeared clean and healthy, just as I had imagined. The people bore a natural beauty, and one saw no beggars, no conspicuous poverty. Life was meant to be lived outdoors. The waters around Stockholm shimmered with 100 islands, dotting the coast like an archipelago of serenity. Sweden gave us Greta Garbo and the Nobel Prize. Norway gave us Ibsen, Denmark, Hamlet. I ventured far into Lapland on a jostling train, but saw, I swear, only one Lapp. He dashed between stations and squatted to wait for the next train, creating a perfect local vignette. I stayed in hotels where one could search in vain for a bell, a phone, or service, yet food and drink would somehow appear as if conjured by air. We passed through Sweden by canal, and stopped for seaweed baths in Copenhagen. One morning I went to the fish market, where elderly women sat on the canal's edge for hours, waiting for the live catch, silver-scaled and glinting in the sun. On their heads, makeshift hats fashioned from newspaper. Schiap stood watching them for a long time. When she returned to Paris, she summoned Colcomvet, the most daring textile manufacturer. "I would like you," she said, "to produce a fabric printed with newspaper text." "But no one will buy it," he protested. "I don't believe that," replied Schiap. She clipped articles, both praise and criticism, and pasted them together like a puzzle. She asked for the design to be printed on cotton and silk in various colors. From these, she created blouses, scarves, bathing caps, and even swimwear. The factory sold thousands of meters. To this day, in a shop near Piccadilly, one can find tobacco pouches printed with newspaper cuttings on waterproof fabric. Thus Schiap found her way into men's wallets. Except for this discovery, the newspaper hats, the journey passed without incident, until we approached Amsterdam. A terrible storm struck the channel. It began at breakfast. A fillet of beef landed squarely in my lap. The rudder broke, pipes collapsed onto my bed, and our little basset, Nat, clung to my neck in despair. Furniture whirled like dervishes, ashtrays flew out one door and returned through another. After 6 hours of storm, we were rescued, and completed the trip by train. I often wonder, what urge compels us to travel? Why not become truly great and let the world come to us? Yet each time, I was filled with joy when returning to Paris or London, where much of my time was spent buying fabric or preparing a new collection. Always a delight. Artists then took a far more active part in the creation and evolution of fashion than they do now. Magazines sought our help and encouragement, and it shows in the pre-war press. Fashion shows were true events, meaningful, beautiful, and artistic. There was no obsession with pleasing buyers, no focus on replication. Today's system breeds uniformity and distorts what is actually happening. What joy it was to collaborate with artists like Bibi Berard, Jean Cocteau, Salvador Dali, Wurtz, Van Dongen, and photographers like Hoyningen-Huene, Horst, Cecil Beaton, Man Ray. They inspired us far beyond the dull materiality of simply producing clothes to sell. When Berard entered a crowded room with his easy gait, easy, despite his solid build, with a beatific smile nearly lost in his beard, swaying forward with the grace of an elephant and his tiny white dog Jacinth in his arms, the entire atmosphere shifted. Word of his arrival would reach the model's cabin, and the spectacle would begin. If he liked something, he shouted it aloud. He had boundless enthusiasm and shared it with everyone. I'm certain many of his ideas caught on because Bibi would repeat endlessly, "It's divine. Divine." Brilliant beyond doubt, he often neglected his painter's career to follow his amusement. Theater consumed him. His sets for the School for Wives and Symphony were magnificent. He adored the stage, and he died in it. The day after my shows, he would send me delightful sketches of his favorite designs, naming them, foxtail, or gutter veil. One evening, while dining at my home on Rue Barbette de Joy, still unfinished, I asked him to design a small screen to block the draft in the vestibule. Of course, he said, but could you pay in advance? I need the cash. Deal, I replied. A month passed. Then another. No screen. I didn't dare ask, but I noticed, each time we met, his face darkened a little more. Eventually, he parted from me in terrible spirits. A month later, I found the courage to bring it up. I knew it, he cried. Why didn't you say earlier that you hated it? But, dear Bibi, I never received it. It turns out the screen had been delivered, not to me, but to the old marquise, owner of the house. Her ancient servant had hidden it away, saying the marquise painted herself and would surely be scandalized by such a thing. Madame la Marquise paints too. But this object, he exclaimed, lifting his hands in horror. The screen, as it turns out, was one of Bibi's finest works, full of talent and feeling. Now placed in the best corner of my salon, it bears no resemblance to the little panel I had requested. Yet Bibi never accepted another sou for his labor. He adored small golden boxes, always carried one in his pocket, and from time to time would take it out, stroke it lovingly. To feel Bibi's approval, his admiration, sometimes even his love, was for me an initiation into the artistic, intellectual, and social world.